Beyond Fukushima, Capturing Untold Stories of Nuclear Disasters. Thank you also to tonight's speaker, the Japanese photojournalist Kazuma Obara, and the chair for this evening, Dr. Ele Carpenter. I'm only going to introduce Dr. Carpenter before handing over to her. We are delighted to have Dr. Carpenter as the chair of tonight's event. She's a leading figure in the field of nuclear culture research. Dr. Carpenter is senior lecturer in curating at Goldsmiths, University of London, and is a curator and writer in politicized art and social networks of making. Dr. Carpenter is also curator of the Nuclear Culture Research Group, which develops artistic and curatorial inquiry into nuclear culture in the UK and internationally. Finally, Dr. Carpenter is the editor of the Nuclear Culture Sourcebook, which offers an introduction to nuclear culture and explores how art and philosophy contribute to a cultural understanding of the nuclear. So with that, I'll hand over to Dr. Carpenter.
Thank you very much. So thank you and welcome everyone. Amazing turnout today, showing what an important artist and important body of work we're going to hear about today. Kazuma Obara is a photographer and has taken a bold move to get closer to nuclear sites, to capture photographically what it means to live in a radioactive environment, to be present and experience a contaminated radioactive environment across centuries and across generations and across different countries and continents and culture. One of the first talks I did about nuclear in Japan was around a film called Nuclear Nation. And I think what we see here is a much broader discussion about the international, global nuclear condition in which we live and work, and its many complications. So in your biographical statement, Obara, you say that there are many visual challenges of capturing the nuclear. So we're very honoured for you to be here today and to see your different approaches of how you tackled the kind of photographic challenge in these different locations and places. So I won't say too much, but I will ask you some questions about the work when we do. So thank you.
Thank you. So thank you so much for introducing. My voice is enough. Can you hear my voice? Okay. So nice to meet you. My name is Kazuma Obara. I'm from Japan, but I just came from Barcelona today, and because I'm just like a kind of announcement, my latest publication just launched yesterday, so I just wrote from Barcelona. My publisher is based in Barcelona, so you can see this is project about the Chernobyl. I will show later, and yeah, I will talk about again, but yeah, anyway. Nice to meet you, and please let me allow to speak my Japanese English for 45 minutes, but I hope you can understand my English. So let me speak about the first series about Fukushima. From 2011, I started my career as photographer, but before being photographer, I was working in financial company as business person. And I was watching the tsunami, through the TV program on my conference room in the company in Kyoto. And Kyoto is like 1,500 kilometers far from Fukushima. But my hometown is very close to Fukushima, actually like 200 kilometers far from Fukushima, but one of the tsunami area. And actually my best friend's house is located in tsunami area, and his house was completely devastated, completely destroyed by tsunami. So when I see the tsunami in my conference room, I decided to quit my job and try to bring the water and food to my friend's place, because just 3 months before the nuclear accident and tsunami, I was there. My parents and I was visiting there. It's like my second hometown. So personally, this place is very close to me. And this is the first I arrived there 16th of March 2011. It's 5 days after the nuclear explosion and tsunami. And first I just shoot about the tsunami area because he's my best friend. He was there and his house was destroyed and his grandfather was missing at the moment, and actually he died. So the first moment I captured those tsunami area, but slowly and slowly I closed to Fukushima area. And in July 9th, I think, in 2011, I visited Fukushima at the first time. And at the first day to visit Fukushima, I met a guy who worked in nuclear power plant. And actually that was the first connection to the nuclear power plant. And he explained me a lot about Fukushima, what is happening inside. Actually, until the end of 2011, there was huge restriction for the press. Only Tokyo Electric Power Company and the government is providing the information until the end of 2011, which means 7 months was whole controlled by the government. So all information came from the government and company. So those workers is really complaining about the working condition because they are not so protected by the government and they are not so protected by the company. So finally, we had a good, nice friends, and they asked me to enter the nuclear power plant because nobody tell the story from the inside. And actually, I was really interested in what is inside. And at the same time, I was really interested in the workers because at the moment, still now, those workers is quite invisible from the public. Those workers are really afraid to be fired after speaking out their experience. So still they don't want to show their face and name in the TV program. There is some mosaic on the face and they just secretly speak out their information still now. So I wanted to show their real situation with their face and name and age, because otherwise they are just hide from the hide by the government, and it is not healthy condition. I wanted to bring more attention to the workers. So I decided to enter the nuclear power plant, and those are the first pictures when I entered the nuclear power plant. So at the moment, this is a resting place which is located 200 meters far from #1 reactor. And there was no news source about the inside, but actually those resting places highly contaminated. But they didn't have so many spaces to get lost, to get rest. So there's no other option, but there is a kinds of hole on the wall, and nuclear waste, nuclear elements got through into the building. But when they get rest, of course they have to put off their mask and they have to eat something. So at the moment, when they get rest, they also have to contaminate it by the radiation inevitably. So those are my pictures in August 2011. So now, if you see the pictures, it's totally different. Yeah, it's already, the contamination is very quickly done, and it's very different situation. But those are just 3 months after the nuclear explosion. And interestingly, inside of the building is all covered by pink seat. It's very strange feeling. Yeah, but I don't know why pink. But yeah, but this is you know, the workers bring some contaminated things from the outside. So every day, I don't know how many times, but they will change the seat. So it makes them keep clean. Yeah, sorry. So, and then after entering nuclear power plant, I started another approach to the workers. As I said, those workers are completely invisible from the public because, as I said, they are scared to be fired. So, but I was really thinking it is necessary to show their face. Otherwise, for the people from the outside, it's quite difficult to imagine who is working there. Most of the people are anonymous, and there's no name and no face. So I wanted to show the faces. And after entering nuclear power plant, I approached 100 workers, and finally 30 people allowed me to take portrait, and I got interviewed. So this is a photo book I wrote, and maybe you can see, and you can pass this photo book. There's some information about the workers and how they felt inside a nuclear power plant. I didn't ask what is the real situation inside, and actually I'm not interested in the real situation because I'm not expert of nuclear industry. I wanted to know more, you know, the normal sense of human being. So I was asking what was happening for themselves after the nuclear power plant, because most of the case, 50% of the workers from Fukushima nuclear power plant is originally from Fukushima, and another 50% is from outside of Fukushima. So some of the people is still working from temporary house and going to nuclear power plant every day. That situation is still continuing. So, you know, those 50% of workers from Fukushima is kinds of victims, but at the same time they have to go to Fukushima nuclear power plant. And as I said, finally 30 people allow me to take pictures, and those are the portrait and the name and age and interviews. And yeah, if you can see the photo book, you can see some interviews. So this was my first project about Fukushima, and then I tried to continue to develop another story about workers, but I really faced some difficulties to convey the story because, you know, the problem is what I can take picture is just, you know, that moment. I cannot take picture of the future, or I cannot take picture of the past. So, but my concern is what will be happening for my friends who are working in nuclear power plant. What will be happening for them for next 10 years or 20 years is my biggest concern. But from my pictures or from the conventional photojournalistic way, it's quite difficult to visualize those situations. So then I try to shift more like a conceptual representation. And I also decided to visit the Chernobyl because in 2015, sorry, it's become a little bit complicated. So in 2015, I became a student in London. I went to London College of Communication, which is located in Elephant and Castle, because I have no educational background of photography. As I said, I was just financial workers, and I have no idea how I can take pictures of the future. So I went to the university and I tried to learn what I can do with photography. And then I decided to go to Chernobyl. And in 2016, it was a 30-year anniversary. And you know, the 1986, the nuclear explosion was happened in Ukraine. So 2016 was a 30-year anniversary. So I thought it was nice timing to think about the next 30 years, what is happening now in Chernobyl, that makes me help to think about our future in Fukushima. And then first I tried to research about the current situation in Chernobyl. And I collect so many hashtags from Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. And what I found from the hashtag is you can see vacation and visiting and tourist and ghost and zombies. So why those words comes up from hashtag is so from 2011, Ukrainian government opened the zone. So after the nuclear explosion, the government set up the zone where we cannot get into because it's highly contaminated. But in 2011, they opened the gate. And now 10,000 people are visiting those zones as tourists. And also, this image is from computer game called Stalker. This is very well-known computer game, and this is story about the zombies in Chernobyl. Some people, he killed zombies in Chernobyl zone. This is the story, and you can see so many zombies. So the hashtags came up from these images, and those are from tourists. And we can see so many selfie, and also we can see this type of pictures. What I've heard from the people who used to live in here is there is no masks after the nuclear explosion. What I heard from him is those tourists, that make this situation. So, and again, zombies, selfie. And you can also visit the Chernobyl nuclear power plant as well. So the main part of the tour is visiting Pripyat, which is a city for the workers before nuclear explosion. And this is the Chernobyl Diaries. This is horror movies, which was made by Hollywood. So through this research, what I found is Chernobyl became already a part of entertainment. And if I do direct representation about Chernobyl, people might misunderstood as part of entertainment. And if I find some problem from current Chernobyl, those images doesn't work for some young generation. So I decided to make very different type of visual from direct representation. But I was really struggling because if I take picture normally, this is just normal pictures. But then luckily I came across this film. This is made by Ukraine and people call Sveno film. And what I can know is my friends who do the guide tour gave me this film, and he found this film in Pripyat city in late 90s. And what I can know is expire date is 1990 and 1991, which means this film was made late 1980. So around the time of the nuclear explosion. And this is the result what I can gain from this film. But there is so many, the lucky accident. When I first received this film from the guide, he explained you have to export 4 minutes or 5 minutes because this is already 30-year-old film. And ISO is 50. And after the expire date, every year the ISO was loose. So he explained me you need to export 4 minutes to 5 minutes. But actually it was mistranslated. When I try to 4 minutes or 5 minutes exposure, of course if you do photography, it's too overexposed. And every picture is just white. And I asked my guide, I just do 4 minutes or 5 minutes exposure, but I couldn't get any images. And then he explained to me, no, minutes, it's seconds. So I need to do 4 seconds exposure, but I did so long exposure. But I just received 8 rolls, and I already used 2 or 3 films. So I just have 4 or 5. And I wanted to have something from that film. And then there was an expert in Kiev, and there's an expert to develop this film, and they recommend to do black and white process. This is color film, but if we do black and white process, we can use low temperature liquid to process. And if we do high temperature process, what I can show from the color film processing is I can see so many dots on the surface. It's like a boiling. But if I do black and white process, I can gain some, this type of images after scanning and emphasizing the black. I can gain this type of images. And when I see these images, I saw this is the images I wanted to have. We cannot see any, the detail is disappeared, and we cannot feel the Chernobyl. So we don't need to think about the entertainment or ghosts or zombies. This is almost nothing if you see the pictures. So my idea is just giving some space to think about the Chernobyl, and then if I give some text, people start thinking about some real situation of current Chernobyl through my images. That is my ideas. And then at the same time, when I came across this film, I also met this lady, Maria. She was born 1986, 5 months after the nuclear explosion, which means she was inside her mother's belly when the nuclear explosion was happened. And when she became 19 years old, she was diagnosed as thyroid disease called Hashimoto disease. But until then, she was misdiagnosed as depression, and she was actually in the mental hospice. And I'm not expert, but what I learned from Wikipedia is that Hashimoto disease and depression is very close, and sometimes people misdiagnosed, and she was that case. But when she was 19 years old, she just know disease comes from Chernobyl nuclear accident. And when she became 23 years old, it's like just 7 years ago, she removed her thyroid. But what is happening for her is, so after removing thyroid, she cannot maintain her hormone balance. So she has to take 20 pills every day until she will die. But even if she takes 20 pills, she cannot have a life like a non-handicapped person. And also the problem is she becomes handicapped person, but her handicap is invisible. So there was scar after the surgery, but thanks to the technology, there's no scar anymore. And it's already 30 years has passed from the accident, and nobody think about the Chernobyl. And she's very active and she's very talkative. So if you meet her, you cannot see any disability from the surface. So the problem is, if I take picture directly, nobody cannot see her disability. And it might be happen, the similar things might be happening in Fukushima as well. And this is what I've learned from her. And I think this is quite important. So after meeting her, I decided to use this film for her story because this film is also similar to her situation. Nobody used for 30 years, and her story is also untold for 30 years. Even she doesn't want to talk by herself because nobody, don't want to think about Chernobyl anymore. So those are the results And this is a book I just published. And my ideas, actually, initially I made this book by my hands because I wanted to, bring the different perspective to the Chernobyl, because people start already, not so thinking about Chernobyl, and it's also difficult to feel invisible pain from the perspective from non-handicapped person. So I wanted to bring different perspective, and one idea is book format. So the first one is this book format is the paperback size. So the image is like this, but there are so many text, so people easily can read the text. And also, I want people to get into the story. And one of the idea is following the format of the film. So there's a real film which was exposed by radiation, but it's not so highly contaminated, so I think it's okay. But the film and the book is same design. And if you are a photographer, you might know that this is medium format film, and we have to break the tape, and we have to open. So this book is also same. You have to break the tape and open the film, and then the film starts. And also, if you open the page, you can see the film. And this is the idea is like this room is like a barrier, and nobody, light up her existence. But if you open the book, the light came into the book, and then, our story start. And I hope the readers get into the story. And also my idea is everything is quite difficult to see. If you see the film, you cannot see the images. And actually my film, I did 5 minutes exposure, which means my film is totally dark, totally black. You cannot see any images from the film. So we need imagination. And also, to think about her disability, we need imagination. So there is a film, but you cannot see the images. Actually, yeah, as I said, you need imagination to think about image. So there is 5 chapters and 5 long interviews and 5 different films. So this is my way to, convey the story with Maria. It's okay. And then, I finished this project in 2017. Then I also started the other project related to nuclear explosion. And this is the final project I will show you. And this is a story about Bikini nuclear testing in 1954. It was happened in Bikini Atoll, close to Australia. And this nuclear testing is also affected to Japan. There's a rain, which is including the nuclear elements. And this is a fishing market. And after the nuclear testing, they put some sign. In this shop, we don't sell, how do I pronounce it? Like atomic tuna, tuna which is contaminated. We didn't sell that type of contaminated tuna. This is sign. So in many places, people are really concerning about the situation of nuclear testing. And this is another newspaper, and you can see 23 people, how do you say that? 26 people are contaminated by nuclear testing. You can see here. And this became quite famous story in Japanese history. And also, if you see the Japanese history book, you can also see after the nuclear testing in Bikini Atoll, 26 fishermen were exposed by radiation. And this is quite famous story about the Bikini nuclear testing in Japan. But actually, just recently, we can just recognize 10,000 fishermen are actually exposed by radiation. And those 10,000 fishermen have kept silent for 60 years. 1954 is just like 9 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And there are already some rumors, like people might have some strange baby if people get married with people from Fukushima or, Hiroshima or Nagasaki. So what I did the research, what I heard from one of the victims is the boss, actually the boss of the shipment, forced them to be silent because their children might face some, the social discrimination as a person who are exposed by radiation. So amazingly, those 10,000 people can be silent. And just recently, they started suing the government because there was no support from the government. But just recently, it was happened. So when I heard that story, that story also reminded me to think about the people in Fukushima, especially those workers, because those workers, same situation, they have just kept silent. And they are trying to get some, the compensation, but actually they cannot show their name. So actually it became not a kind of big movement. And I think it is very important story for Japanese. So I decided to visit some of the place where so many fishermen head to Bikini Atoll. And this is a story about one of the victims. And his name is Oguro, Mr. Oguro. And he already passed away by cancer almost 10 years ago. So what I can do was I just asked her daughter. But her daughter was also know that story just 4 years ago. When the news came out, like 10,000 people are contaminated by radiation. And then daughter is just thinking, my father might be one of the victims of nuclear testing in Bikini Atoll. And she started some research, and then I came across her. So we did the research with her. And what I can find from her story is actually her family has strange story. So in 1954, nuclear testing was happened. And 1 year after nuclear testing, her brother was born, just 1 year after the nuclear explosion. And 2 years after the nuclear explosion, another son was born. The mother was pregnant, but that boy died in her mother's stomach, in her mother's belly. And 6 years after the nuclear explosion, the father became sick, and he had to quit his job as fisherman. And then he had to work in the land. And then what happened for our family is he started to child abuse for the son who was born just 1 year after the nuclear explosion. And the other family member, like our mother and daughter, didn't affected by that child abuse. But only the son who was born 1 year after the nuclear explosion had a brutal violence from the father. And just recently, not recently, but I think 18 years ago, actually the mother, the wife of the fisherman, committed suicide. And before she committed suicide, she explained to the daughter there was a very important document, so you have to keep, safe. The mother told to the daughter. But after she committed suicide, the fisherman, the husband, burned all document. So she tried to bring that document, but before bringing the document was all burned, and nobody knows what is that. But what we can do is just have imagination that document might be some kinds of the document related to nuclear explosion or something like that, but nobody knows. So what I can do as photographer is when I heard that story, I just decided to following their father's footstep using their father's camera. I could find this camera, and this camera was bought by father 2 years after nuclear explosion. And what was interesting for me was the lens was totally covered by mold, so the surface is quite white. And the result of that mold create whitish images. The image is not clear, and that image makes me remind one of the disease of nuclear testing. So when people are exposed by radiation, the surface of the eyes became white. I don't know how to say in English, but so what they saw is a little bit white images, and some of the edge of the eyesight is lost. So when I see the images, the image is quite similar to that disease. So I like that ideas to use this lens and following his footstep. So I visited the many places where he worked, and the mother committed suicide. And also I visited the Hiroshima Peace Museum, and this is also important for her family history. In 1954, nuclear explosion happened, and at the moment there was huge social movement against anti-nuclear and against US. And at the time, of course, it's already Cold War period, and US is really afraid Japan become part of the communist zone. So what CIA did 2 years after the nuclear explosion is they started some kinds of propaganda from small place. They provide some kinds of pro-nuclear movie in small theater in their family's place. And what the daughter heard from the mother is someday the nuclear power might be change the direction of the typhoon. Those type of propaganda was heavily gives some impact to those families, and also because of that, I imagine those victims, those fishermen, is not be able to speak out about the nuclear things because people started supporting the nuclear things. And the one of the iconic things of the propaganda is CIA removed all exhibition from Hiroshima Peace Museum. If you visit Hiroshima Museum, you can see so many, the atomic images and some of the clothes which was affected by atomic bomb. So, but the CIA removed all exhibition and placed to the other building. And what they did is they started the exhibition about pro-nuclear exhibition in Hiroshima Peace Museum. And thanks to that, because of that exhibition, that anti-nuclear movement and anti-US movement is slowly and slowly shrinking and shrinking, and finally it's disappeared. So Hiroshima is an iconic place to against nuclear, power, but those CIA people use that place very effectively. And this is some images from the catalog of the exhibition. And this is one of the theater, which might be promote some propaganda in her place. We cannot see, but I just imagine. And this is a place where her mother committed suicide. So this is the last images. But what I try to show in this, the small presentation is, I studied my photographic career as photojournalist. And actually my first work, when I sneak into the nuclear power plant, those images were published from The Guardian. So, I was quite conventional photojournalist, and my approach is very conventional approach. But slowly and slowly, I faced some difficulties to visualize invisible nuclear program. And then I have to shift to different direction. And I don't know, this, the visual have strong impact, like, conventional photojournalism. It's quite difficult to understand if you see these one images. You cannot see anything from nuclear testing or the pain from the victims. But if this become the book, or if I can combine 100 images and showing as book or exhibition, I believe that is more stronger than one images, and also it have some layers, multiple layers to convey some difficult stories. So now I'm try to do that type of things, and if you have some time after the event, I bring some sample so you can see my challenge as photographer. Yes, so I finished my presentation.
Thank you very much. A hard act to follow. Thank you.
Thank you.
Your work obviously is really important, and I think we're all kind of privileged to hear you talk about it and to understand your thinking around the nature of visibility of radiation, because radiation is something that is imperceptible to the human senses. We can't see it, we can't smell it, we can't feel it. We can sense it with a Geiger counter, but we can also sense it with photographic film. And the history of photography is really a kind of a history of radiation. If we think about Becquerel and his glass of uranium salts, which he put on a piece of photographic paper with a Maltese cross. Well, he did it once without the Maltese cross by mistake, and he saw this imprint on the photographic paper, and he did it again with a Maltese cross at the bottom of the glass to see if he thought was really happening, which was the radioactive salts making a print on the paper. So this this kind of fogging or exposure of capture of light, capturing the energy of radiation as light through photography is really a history of photography, I think. And so your photojournalistic approach, as it moves into more of a kind of photographic sensing of the film, and your use of the specific film from the Ukraine and the specific camera in Bikini Atoll is really really interesting, I think, because it's a material relationship between the means of production of your image is tied to the location and the site through which those images come. And I think you talk a lot about sort of visibility and invisibility, which is a kind of something that's talked a lot around nuclear aesthetics. It's probably the most sort of common challenge for artists. And I think it raises the question of privileging the visual, because we do privilege the visual, and as a photojournalist you absolutely do. I mean, you have to, it's the image that is communicating. But how do we represent things that are not visual? Well, of course we have language, we have poetry, we have music, and we have all sorts of other sensory forms. But if we're working with a visual material, how do you deal with not privileging the visual? And I really like the way that you talked about the imagination, and by not privileging the visual, we privilege the imagination. So you have space to think, and it's kind of like poetry. You can reflect and contemplate, and you can kind of occupy these spaces yourself, because they're not totally prescribed for you. They're not giving you all the information so that there's no room for you to think for yourself. So I think this is a really important kind of artistic aspect of your photographs, which are perhaps different from a more journalistic photographic approach, where that's not necessarily required. So I really wanted to ask you about, I mean, your work is so interesting, I could talk about it for hours, but I really wanted to ask you about, you've been to these 3 different sites. What are the kind of connections between these different sites? I can see that your photographic approach has been quite different, but starting with Fukushima, moving to Chernobyl, and then moving to Bikini Atoll, these are generationally different nuclear events. What happens when you go to those 3 sites, one after another, year after year, and you take that as photographs? What did you learn from that experience?
So the things which is similar things is, for me, it might be very Japanese things, but the one iconic thing is people want to hide by themselves. That is a very iconic thing for me. Most of the case, Ukraine is a little bit different from Japan. Like many people try to speak out. I am victims, and I think it's quite normal. But maybe Fukushima and Bikini case is quite Japanese case. People want to hide, and they don't want to, show their light. I need have light to gain some compensation from the government or something. They don't think about. They just afraid the social discrimination. And why this is happening? I was thinking why this is happening. And when I see Fukushima and Bikini, what was happening at the first moment, first reaction, right after the nuclear explosion was, majority was, really afraid, of course, and people speaking out and complaining about food and environment and nuclear waste. And then, the real victims in the center of the Fukushima become real minority. And when I visited the demonstration, people are just thinking about, they're saying about anti-nuclear things. Of course it is important, but most of the people didn't talk about Fukushima people. And that is what I saw in the demonstration. And the same things happen in Bikini.
Right.
People are just thinking about the tuna or vegetable. And then that is, really those Fukushima and Bikini victims makes them very isolated and real minority.
Yeah, I think from my understanding of the psychic effects of radiation, and also thinking about different concepts of nuclearity, there's 2 things going on there. So if we look at Gabrielle Heck's idea of nuclearity, which is to look at how some parts of the nuclear industry or the nuclear economy are deemed nuclear and other parts are deemed not nuclear. So the health and safety and health physics, the protocols, the regulatory frameworks around nuclear materials are very different, as distinguished around nuclearity. And she develops this term really to look at uranium mining and the lack of regulation around mining. Yet when you come to a nuclear power plant in the West or in Japan, it's highly regulated environment, whereas a mine is not historically. I mean, I guess it depends where you're looking and when. So it's interesting to look at what aspects of the landscape, the inhabited landscape, and people's daily life and their food and experience that is considered to be nuclear and is regulated and protected. So we have the restrooms that are highly covered in this very strange kind of pink plastic, and then we have in Fukushima City, we have the topsoil being removed and wrapped in blue plastic and buried underground. And there might be there might be materials that we might think of as not being nuclear that are classified as nuclear, and then other materials that are the other way around. I've got in the middle now, which is so some that are nuclear that are classified as not nuclear, and things that are perhaps not very highly nuclear that are classified as nuclear. And why on earth does that happen? It's really, really confusing, and it makes it very difficult for people to navigate the reality of their life when you've got these strange regulatory frameworks. So you have an extremely contaminated area that is totally invisible, and then a very low level contaminated area which is highly public, so that all the focus and the discourse is around what's happening here and not what's happening over there. And I think that's perhaps endemic in different radioactive disasters. And then the psychic effects of radiation, which I think you're really the kind of the fogging of the image, which is something that you have a number of different techniques of creating this fogging, but the fogging is also represents the way in which radiation fogs an image. So it's a kind of way of sensing, or providing a visual sensing of a radioactive environment in a really effective way. And I guess everybody responds to this differently, but the psychic effects of radiation, which we see in the science fiction films, that you showed around Chernobyl, the stalker video and the zombies, these are the kind of archetypes of fear of the nuclear, which are kind of captured in the 1950s with Gojira and the different iterations of that, becoming less and less politicized over time, which is interesting. And so the psychic effects perhaps should not be undermined as only psychological, if you like. The psychic effects of radiation are very real and very tangible. And you talked about the young woman, Maria, is that her name? Who was born in Chernobyl in 1986, and the relationship between her depression and her thyroid, and it seems completely plausible that these things would go together. Why wouldn't they? Living through a very complex sort of environment where you can't trust, and you have very little information about what is safe and what is not safe. And the lack of information is something that you talked about right at the beginning with TEPCO, and of course it happens with Chernobyl when there's, I can never remember how many days it is, 16 or 19 days before the Soviet Union actually makes a statement that the Chernobyl accident has happened. So there's another kind of delay, and again the delay with the fishermen in Bikini Atoll is well, it's a sort of endless delay. I mean, people were never really properly told, in extraordinary circumstances. So I think the capturing of the images in a book gives a kind of narrative or a chronology or a particular moment in time, and as you say, allows the abstraction of the situation to be put in a wider narrative context, but for that abstraction to exist as a form of reality, not just as an artistic trope perhaps, but actually the kind of perhaps nonsensical kinds of images that we might see in the world come from quite extreme sets of circumstances. And I had another question for you. I'm just going to find it. Oh yes. So you're using film.
Yes.
You're using analog film.
Mm-hmm.
Have you worked with digital images and radiation at all? Because when the Fukushima accident happened, I heard reported, but I've never seen verified, that hard drives, electronic hard drives, were wiped and data disturbed by the excessive radiation of the explosion. So I wondered if you knew anything about that and if you might comment on that photographically.
Yeah, when I entered the nuclear power plant, I bring the digital camera. Actually, it was kind of toy camera. It was quite small. And when I see the images, it's like the noise is quite strong. But I don't know, this is because toy camera, it was quite small. But when I see the video of the nuclear explosion in Chernobyl, one of my friends who I met in Slabutich city, this is a new city for the workers for Chernobyl nuclear power plant. And some photographer get into the inside nuclear power plant and see the real debris of nuclear explosion. And then so many noises, and noise is quite strong. And yeah.
When you say noise, do you mean audio noise or visual noise?
Visual noise, yeah.
Visual
so
noise,
dots.
so little dots,
Yeah.
spots, and that's
Yeah.
in the digital, within the digital image.
Yes.
Yeah.
And my image remind me that picture, but still I'm not sure this is because radiation or just because camera is small.
Gosh.
Yeah.
I think, I'm not sure I would want to be in an environment where a digital camera is picking up the radiation fog. I think that's quite a high level of radiation needed to make that occur.
And I just forgot to say about one thing. Now in Japan, 200 children became cancer. And it was reported, but actually nobody see their faces, and only the things we can see is that when they became adult, over 20 years old, some of the the people is appeared on the media. But what I really shocked 2 years ago was the Japanese TV company make a document about the children of cancer, and they put the mosaic when they are young. And I thought, is it okay? From the perspective of the children, it looks like we are protecting the children, but I don't think it is protecting the children in real meaning. I thought children is feeling like I cannot appear. So when I see the documentary, many people said, they did it, like they showed the real problem of the nuclear explosion. But I didn't think so, that it's really brutal way to hide the children. So I wanted to ask for the expert to, to learn the culture of nuclear, that if you know that type of, things,
It's really complex because
Yeah.
it's to do with stigma, as you described. in all of these places, the stigma of being contaminated or not knowing if you are contaminated or not. And we know that radiation affects cell mutation, and those cell mutations might not affect you if you are someone who has been contaminated, but it can affect the next generation. And so that silence is a kind of protective factor, not just for you, but your children and your grandchildren. It's a protective factor within your family. So it's understandable, you know, the 10,000 fishermen keeping silent is extraordinary. But it's understandable that if they are aware of the kind of stigma around Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that could be the case. So there's another layer of stigma. It's not just about disability or about ill health or about sickness and stigmas that we might have, or social kind of thinking that we might have around that, which has been challenged mostly in most societies. But the kind of the lack of information and the lack of not knowing. Now, some restricted information, of course, is political, but also the effects of radiation are not universal and they're not uniform, they're stochastic. So, you know, it's like saying you would, if there was an outbreak of flu, not everyone in this room would actually get flu, but if we were all exposed to radiation, we won't all necessarily get sick, and we would get sick in different ways. Some people this week, some people not for 20 years, and some people it wouldn't be them, but it would be their children or their great-grandchildren. So it's actually very difficult to trace and to, to kind of demonstrate causal links. But of course those causal links are there and the research is done, but how that is presented and documented and is another question. And I know that just in the last few weeks there's been a conference on the effects of low-level radiation, and there's new research on the effects of low-level radiation. The international community is kind of generally agreed on the effects of high-level radiation exposure. We know what happens to the human body, but on a lower level over longer periods of time, it's harder to demonstrate. It's much more complex. And so the element of fear and stigma in that huge space, which may be generations, is very complex to navigate, I think. So I think your work, particularly you're working with different generations of families as well, to look at that intergenerational effect, and that's a really important part of storytelling. But it's also a way of passing on information about nuclear events from one generation to another generation. And to do that globally is really important, because you start to build up a picture of the cultural effects, if you like, and the patterns of behaviour, and the destruction.